This story takes place in November of 2017, and I was 18. I'm a very short girl, only about 4'10", and I get anxious when someone even looks at me in a way that suggests they might not like me. So needless to say, I'm incredibly non-confrontational. My friend and I were out shopping. It was something we'd do maybe every few months, just to bond, since we didn't have much time to hang out due to college. And she's just like me, barely scraping 5'1", and very non-confrontational. It's probably why we became friends. On every shopping trip, we would find ourselves in Ann Summers. We're both overly endowed and struggled to find bras anywhere. And Ann Summers always had great sales, so we grabbed the cheap bras while we could. This shopping trip wasn't any different. We browsed shops until we got to Ann Summers, but that's when things took a bit of a turn. I'd barely stepped foot into the shop when a woman with some sort of Slavic accent stopped me, her finger jamming into my chest. "Spit the gum out," she demanded. Assuming that she was an employee, I gave a very sheepish, "I'm really sorry," and ran out of the shop to spit the gum out and throw it away. When I went back in, I realized that this woman was not an employee. She was a customer who was browsing and happened to be near the door when my friend and I entered the shop. It should have been obvious to me at the time. No salesperson would ever behave like that. Not one that wanted to keep their job anyways. But I kept my head down when I walked past her, holding my breath in hopes that she wouldn't notice me again. And she didn't, and I thought I was in the clear. My friend and I browsed the shop, trying to avoid the woman. But the shop wasn't very big, probably only 15 feet by 18 feet. So eventually, I ended up at the sales stand by the door where she had been since while browsing. I was looking at the price tags, but realized that I didn't know what the discount was. So I leaned over slightly to check the discount sign. It's important that I note that this woman had a pushchair, a stroller for the Americans. And you'd think that she'd maybe had a child in this pushchair. But no, it was full of plastic carrier bags. I didn't look too much at it, but I could tell that everything in there was double bagged and tied shut. Whatever was in those bags, she wanted to protect. The sense of protection became very relevant because when I leaned over to look at the discount sign, I was leaning slightly closer to her pushchair. I was still about 3 FT away from it, but apparently that was too close. The woman was on the other side of the chair, but the moment she saw me, she ran around to it where I was standing. She hit me in the face. It was somewhere between a slap and a punch, and I couldn't quite tell because I was in shock. All I knew is that it hurt. "Watch the personal space," she hissed in my ear, and I apologized to her. This woman just hit me, and I apologized to her. I regret it now, but at the time, I didn't want to provoke her any further. Not that I knew what I did to provoke her in the first place. In my shock, I turned around and ran to the back area, grabbing my friend's hand and pulling her with me. The back area was separated by a tiny wall that only stretched halfway across the shop since they stored the adult toys there and wanted to keep them out of sight of the general public. I stood there holding my friend's hand and shaking as I whispered, "She just hit me," to my friend, and we stood there for a good minute in silence. My friend was positioned in a way that she could see the rest of the store while I hid behind the wall. "She's gone," my friend told me, and I let out a breath that I didn't even know that I was holding. "Can we stay here for a while?" I asked my friend, worried that the woman would be outside waiting for me. The front of the store was open, but she could have easily just been a couple of feet down the road and out of sight, waiting for me to leave. My friend agreed, and we slowly browsed the shop again. About 5 minutes later, we got to the counter to check out, and the girl working the counter looked outside and then back at us. "And that woman's been in here for 30 minutes. I didn't know what to do," she told the two of us. "What did she say to you?" "She told me to spit out my gum when we first came in, and then she hit me because I was too close to her." "She hit you?" The worker was wide-eyed. "If I had known that, I would have called security. I'm so sorry." I smiled and shrugged. "It's fine." It wasn't really fine, but it wasn't the worker's fault. She didn't look much older than I did. And I wouldn't have known what to do in that situation either. Still shaken up, my friend and I made our way out of the store. I looked around but didn't see the woman. "Can we just go home now?" I asked my friend. We hadn't finished browsing all the shops, but I was so paranoid that we'd bump into that insane woman again. She agreed, and we got the bus home. When I got home, my parents encouraged me to report the incident to the police, and I called the non-emergency line. Their answer was basically, "Well, what do you expect us to do about it?" And unless I went back to the Ann Summers and requested the security footage, which I wasn't sure if they actually had, they wouldn't do anything. It's been just over 3 years now, and I'm sure that that woman was likely to have been homeless and or on drugs. It's the only explanation I can think of for the carrier bags, her protectiveness. It was either everything she owned or drugs, or maybe even both. This happened just last week. I live alone in a small college town, although I'm not a student or a faculty member. My apartment is in a duplex on a residential street, just a few blocks from campus, which most of the students have left for their winter break. Things get very quiet when they're not around. Late Wednesday night, I woke up to a disturbing sound outside. It was someone crying, but not in a normal way. This was more like delirious wailing. The person didn't sound grief-stricken or panicked, and there were no cries for help. Otherwise, I'd probably have gone outside cautiously to check things out, and this sounded more like someone doing an impression of a ghost, but being a little too convincing. A sort of woo-oo over and over. Not a pleasant way to wake up, I'll be honest. I got up and looked out the window but didn't see anyone, and I couldn't tell where the sound was coming from. After a few minutes, the wailing grew distant, and things got quiet. I went back to sleep, a little unsettled. Thursday night rolled around, and I went to bed as usual, wondering if I'd hear anything again. Sure enough, I was awakened a few hours later, but this time, the sound was completely different. At first, I wondered if there had been a heavy snowfall, because I heard what sounded like the edge of a shovel scraping the sidewalk. It was very rhythmic. 2 plodding footsteps followed by a long and drawn-out scraping. Thud, thud, scrape. Thud, thud, scrape. I got up and looked out the window, where I saw no snow but a dense fog and a woman across the street. It took me a minute to tell if she was wearing some strange hat, but then I realized that the hat was her hair. It was long down to her waist and completely filthy and matted, bunched up into a single mass that looked like a gigantic glistening hairball. The woman was standing with her shoulders hunched forward and her arms crossed behind her back, like a figure skater or dancer. And she was doing an unusual sort of dance where she would take 2 heavy stomps and then glide, as if she were on ice skates. But there was no ice. I couldn't tell how she was gliding so gracefully and effortlessly across the pavement. It was almost hypnotic to watch because she appeared to be elderly and frail. But she could spin, glide, and maintain balance on a level that would be hard for me to keep up with. Each time she would glide, I'd hear the scrape sound of her shoe against the pavement. There was no additional step to the dance, just the rhythmic stomp, stomp, glide, headed in one direction before twirling around and doing the same steps in the other. After a few minutes, she stopped and then stooped down like a runner at the starting line, dramatically leaning forward with her fingertips lightly touching the ground. She stayed that way for a good minute or two, and it was a very unsettling thing to see in the shadows and fog. Then she slowly stood up, turned facing away from me, and got up on her very tiptoes with her long, skinny arms outstretched. Then she broke into a rapid tiptoeing motion that professional ballerinas do. In my mind, I heard that classic cartoon sound effect that plays when a character scampers away without a sound. She danced into the fog, and I haven't seen or heard anything from her since. I'm a 19-year-old female living in the Pacific Northwest. A couple of months ago, I was looking for extra work because my hours at my regular job were terrible. I'm quiet, anxious, and don't have any friends, so of course I turned to Craigslist. I knew the site could be sketchy, but I was desperate for side gigs and hadn't had any luck. As someone with no skills and not willing to do OnlyFans, one ad caught my attention. It offered $50 for someone to take photos of a property using either a camera or something above an iPhone 12. I have an iPhone 14, so I figured it would be easy. The ad promised it would only take an hour or 2. I emailed the poster and soon got a text back. The man said I seemed like the perfect fit and invited me over that same day. What's funny is I actually made a post on R2 Afraid to Ask, asking if it was a dumb idea, and everyone told me to take a person with me. I didn't, and I deleted that post shortly after. The house was about 20 minutes outside of town, surrounded by dense forests. It was small and run down, but nothing really raised alarms. The man who greeted me looked like he was maybe in his mid-50s, unremarkable. He invited me inside, and the house was completely empty. No furniture, just dust and dirt. I asked where to start taking photos, but he kept dodging the question, making small talk and asking personal questions about me instead. My anxiety was building, so I kept the small talk going, but then he began staring at me intensely. I dropped my phone at one point when we eventually started taking photos throughout the house, and when he picked it up, he held onto it a little too long before giving it back. Unprompted, while taking photos of the master bedroom, he brushed my face with his hand and complimented my skin. I knew it was stupid coming here, but at that point my blood truly ran cold, and I was done making excuses in my head. I made a quick excuse to leave something about my mom, but when I turned toward the door, he grabbed my arm. I still have the picture that I took after the ordeal of the bruises on my forearm. It felt like it was going to get snapped in half. I had brought a small knife for self-defense, a gift from my paranoid mom, who would have never let me come here if she had known. And without thinking, I pulled it out and stabbed him in the arm. It was released with the push of a small button, and he let go, swinging at my arm with the knife, but I was already running out of the house. I got into my car and drove until I reached a gas station, and my heart was calm. I called the police and explained everything. They did take it seriously, and I came in to make a report and answer some questions. They searched the property and the surrounding forest, but didn't find him, and the house had turned out to be abandoned. In the basement, they found a pack of zip ties. A report was made, but I know he's still out there. I call sometimes for updates, but it's never anything of substance. I've never told anyone about this other than the police, not even my mom. I know typing this. I sound pretty unbothered, but that was the first time anything like that has ever happened to me, and I have trouble leaving my house most days. I decided to type this out here as maybe a way of getting it off my chest, since it plagues my thoughts constantly. This happened a while ago, 2015 to be exact, but I'll probably never forget it. I was around 21 at the time, female, and still fairly new to the city. I had just gotten out of a bad relationship. Wasn't in the best place mentally and didn't know many people in town besides my ex and his friends. I was on a dating or hookup app, looking for people to hang out with casually, maybe find a friends with benefits situation or something. I matched with a 25-year-old guy named Simon. We talked sporadically in the app for a few days, and he told me he was in a band and lived in a house with his bandmates. He sent me their music, just some audio track on YouTube with a heavily edited still image of 4 or 5 guys playing rock instruments, and one of them looked like him. The music was an odd mix of styles and not really my thing, but whatever. He seemed like a nice enough guy. After a few days, he stopped replying, and I figured that was that and moved on. Then one day at work, I got a message from him apologizing for being busy and inviting me to a barbecue with his friends and bandmates in their yard. He had mentioned that their band manager provided the house to them to live in. Given the lack of views on their YouTube video and the fact that I had only seen one photo of him playing in the band, I figured he was probably exaggerating. I assumed it was more likely a bar manager friend gave them a discount on rent in exchange for being a house band or something. And I didn't think much of it beyond that. Normally, I wouldn't have agreed to go to a barbecue alone in a stranger's house. But I was really bored and figured that I might be able to overcome some social anxiety, maybe even make some female friends, since he made it sound like a big party. I looked up the neighborhood that he gave me, and it was a suburban area with lots of families. I figured being in a yard on a nice summer day wouldn't be overly risky because there would be plenty of neighbors outside. Plus, it was just a few train stops away from my workplace, and I was off in a few hours. I told him I wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea, since I didn't know him well. But I'd stop by for a bit, as long as I didn't have to go inside the house. He assured me that was totally fine, which made me feel better. I even avoided drinking anything for the rest of my shift, so I wouldn't have to use the bathroom and risk going inside, since he had implied the event was already underway. I was anxious about just showing up, plus I knew finding a specific address from the backyard side would be kind of tricky, so I asked Simon if he could meet me at the train station, since he said it was a quick walk. He agreed, and I let him know when I was leaving work and what time my train would arrive at his station. Now, red flag number 1. When I got to the train station at around 5:30 p.m., I looked around but couldn't find him. I messaged him, and he said he was running behind and told me to start walking toward the neighborhood. I was about halfway across the massive train station parking lot when I finally spotted him wandering toward me. I recognized his clothes bell-bottoms. Not common, especially for men at the time. And long hair, but up close, his face looked noticeably different from his photos. Maybe it was heavy-duty editing, or maybe he used pictures of his brother or something, I don't even know, but he looked older, not 25, more like 35. And this was the first real red flag, but I brushed it off. Maybe he was just self-conscious. Maybe he smoked a lot and never wore sunscreen. Maybe he just hadn't taken new pictures in a while. And besides, I was mostly there to make friends, so I told myself not to judge. Oh, and he was already very drunk. Friends were heavy drinkers, so that didn't seem strange. He was hosting a barbecue with friends, after all. The second red flag came shortly after when we arrived at the front door. I reminded him that I wasn't comfortable going inside the house, but he assured me that we just had to walk through to get to the backyard. Okay, fine, it wasn't the kind of neighborhood where you could just walk around the house to get to the backyard. We would have had to backtrack to the main road to go down the alley directly to the backyard. And I figured he just forgot what I said about not wanting to go inside and didn't want to cause a bunch of trouble. So I just sort of went with it. We got into the house, and he immediately closed the door and locked the deadbolt and knob behind me. I didn't think that was too weird since nobody was hanging out inside, and a lot of people were just in the habit of locking the door when they come in. But it did still give me the heebie-jeebies for some reason. Then Simon told me that he'd really like to give me a tour of the house. I politely declined and reminded him that I was just there for the barbecue, and he said that he and his bandmates had worked really hard to get the house and was really proud of it. At that point, I was getting really skeptical because usually when guys would tell me things that seemed a bit far-fetched, they'd let the truth slip by the time they got me in their house. But still, I convinced myself that I was being unreasonable. I was already in a stupid house anyways, and he insisted to be quick. Not the wisest choice, again, I know, but I was pretty good at explaining away red flags, so at this point, Simon still mostly had a dopey stoner art guy kind of vibe as far as I was concerned. He didn't really seem like a threat, just an insecure oddball who sucks at communicating and fibs a bit. Not unlike my ex, who was definitely emotionally and verbally abusive, but it never escalated past that. I figured it'd work. He'd get handsy, and I'd get called a prude for not sleeping with him. I didn't have a lot of self-worth at that time, obviously, so once again, I just went with it. The tour started pretty uneventfully. Other than the decor in the common area was obviously chosen by a middle-aged Martha Stewart enthusiast, and not a bunch of guys in a band or their fake band manager. I didn't know if this should make me feel better or worse. On one hand, he was clearly lying, but on the other, it made me think it was probably just someone's mom's house. And she was out of town and didn't want to tell me that he lived at a friend's parents' home and didn't actually have a paying job. Again, total red flag, but I could rationalize it at the time. The bedroom doors were all closed, the bathroom was unremarkable, and he then showed me the kitchen, and I finally saw through the window that there was nobody in the backyard. There weren't even barbecue supplies around, no burgers thawing on the counter, no cocktail supplies lying around, nothing. I asked him where everyone was and why he lied about the barbecue, and he told me that his bandmates were still on tour, and they were just running behind due to van trouble, but they should be back any minute so we could start the party. I asked him why he wasn't on tour with them if he's in the band, and I don't even remember what his answer was to that because it didn't make any sense. And at this point, I'm out of mental gymnastics to convince myself that this guy isn't just completely full of crap. And I'm really freaked out. It took me long enough. I'm smarter now, don't worry. I started trying to figure out a way to get out of this situation, though. I hoped that once he was done with the tour, we could go outside, even just for a minute, and I could just leave. I've been in some sketchy situations in the past, but luckily nothing so bad that they tried very hard to physically stop me when I walked away in a semi-public place. I just wasn't comfortable doing that inside the house. I knew this guy was full of crap, but I had no idea how much worse it would get. I instinctively pretended to believe his nonsense. He offered me a beer, and I said, "No thanks," because I had to work in the morning. He said okay and cracked one open for himself. He then wanted to take the tour downstairs, and I could see from the top of the stairs that the basement was the dark and creepy kind with really small windows. So right there, thankfully, I refused. I asked if we could go back outside, and he said, "After the tour." I tried to argue about going into the basement and told him I had a spider phobia, didn't like basements, etc. All lies, but anything to keep him from realizing that he was what I was afraid of. He started to get agitated about my reluctance, so I figured it would be better to just let him show me the damn basement, and then hopefully we could go outside, because I really didn't know what else to do. The basement was fairly unremarkable: couch, TV, elliptical, until I noticed something else that gave me chills. The house was probably built in the 1990s or late 80s at the absolute earliest. But I saw a door that looked just like the heavy foam-lined door to the cold storage room in my grandma's house. The kind that only opens from the outside. It was just a smaller version of the big metal doors on commercial walk-in fridges. And it looked really out of place in this house. I absolutely would not go anywhere near that door. He opened it and told me it was their soundproof music studio. I looked inside from a few meters away, and it did look soundproof. It was about the size of a bedroom, and I could see a few guitars and amps in it, mattress toppers on the walls. No drum kit or recording equipment that I could see, though, and he insisted that I go inside to get a better look. He was standing outside the door, motioning for me to go inside, and my God, the alarm bells were really going off now. At this point, I realized that I could actually die here if I wasn't careful. I turned around and ran up the stairs. He closed the door and followed me, asking what was wrong, acting like I was being unreasonable for not wanting to see his soundproof music studio. And that's when I realized this was way sketchier of a situation than any of my ex's nonsense, and I was freaked out. At that point, my main objective was getting out of this house. The front and back doors were both closed and locked, so I tried to run. He'd be able to get to me before I could get the locks open. The bathroom didn't have a window, the house had a convoluted floor plan that I wasn't familiar with, and he was much bigger than I was. He was the tall, lanky type someone who could run fast, even if they were out of shape and smoked a pack a day. I pretended that I was okay with hanging out in the hopes that he'd chill out a bit, and we made small talk for a few minutes. He cracked another beer, and thankfully he calmed down, and I desperately mentioned yet again that it was beautiful outside and suggested that we go sit in the yard while we waited. He said no and started to get agitated that I wanted to leave already. I told him that I could stay, but I'd really like to smoke a cigarette. He told me that we could smoke inside and pointed to a cereal bowl full of cigarette butts. God damn it. We sat down at the table and lit some cigarettes, and as he was smoking, he started rolling a joint, which he promptly lit as soon as his cig was done. He offered me some, and I said, "No thanks." He insisted, so I took the smallest puff I could. I'm a pretty seasoned weed smoker, but I pretended to cough excessively and told him that I was a novice, that was more than enough for me. And for a liar himself, he thankfully wasn't very good at picking up on the lies of others. And after we smoked, he asked if I'd like to watch a movie until his bandmates got back. I told him that I was really looking forward to spending the day outside, and suggested that we go for a walk or visit the park ideas he did not like or appreciate. At this point, I was just trying to keep as much distance as possible between us, but he stayed close enough that I could smell the beer on his breath. He grabbed me by the waist, and I backed away. I asked about the barbecue food to try and change the subject, to make him think that I still believed what he was telling me. He started to get angry again and sternly reiterated that his bandmates should be home any minute. My anxiety was absolutely through the roof. I tried to calm him down again with very generic small talk, and now I don't know how I got so lucky, but the next thing that happened might have saved me. Simon went to the fridge to get another beer and pulled out an empty box. At this point, he was getting even more pissed off than before. So I went out on a limb and suggested that we go get more beer for the party, because I was out of ideas. I was terrified that suggesting once again that we leave the house would enrage him even more. But I had to try. And thankfully, though, his eyes lit up with the possibility that I might actually be down to drink with him. And he agreed. As we were walking to the liquor store, I still didn't really have a plan because I was no longer comfortable just walking away from this menace in this weirdly desolate suburb. But I was extremely relieved to be out of that house. When we got to the store, I told him that I didn't need to go inside if he was just grabbing beer, and he insisted that I had to go in. At that point, I was so stressed and frazzled that I just went with him and hoped that a good opportunity to leave would arise inside. He asked what kind of beer I wanted, and I reminded him that I had to work tomorrow and didn't want to drink too much. And he demanded to know what kind of beer I wanted. So I just named the first one that came to mind. We went to pay, and the cashier was kind of an a-hole, so I didn't ask for help. I probably should have, but I panicked. I regretted it, but I also remembered the times my ex told people that I was crazy so they wouldn't take me seriously. And this liquor store guy definitely seemed like he'd fall for that. I had one last idea before I took my chances running. There was a drugstore across from the liquor store. I told Simon that I had to buy a toothbrush, something that vaguely implied that I might stay over. And he eagerly agreed, but tried to follow me inside. I told him that you can't bring beer into a drugstore. I have no idea if that's true. I doubt it's a law, but this drunk douchebag believed it and agreed to wait outside. And now, my naive self thought maybe I could just wander around long enough and he'd get the hint or leave, but no. Half an hour later, he was still standing there, staring through the window. I ended up hovering near the tills, waiting for a big group of friendly-looking people, and when they left, I followed them out and immediately told Simon to leave me alone and go home. I said it firmly and loudly enough to imply that I would make a scene if need be. Simon looked at the people getting into the car, who were now pausing and staring at us, and then he just turned around and left. Bizarrely anticlimactic, thank God, and I ran to the train station and never heard from him again. When I got home, his app profile had either blocked me or been deleted. Years later, I wish I had reported him. It bothers me to wonder if he tried it again, but made sure that the fridge was stocked. This happened to me many years ago. I am 38 now, and I believe this took place when I was 14 or 15. My family, consisting of myself, my mother, and my brother, who was 6 years my junior, were in the process of moving down the road sometime in the near future and had been fixing the new place up, so it was move-in ready for us. We had enlisted some help from extended family, mainly my mother's cousin and her adult sons and their wives, to help paint our bedrooms. During one of these days of hard work, we collectively decided that we all wanted Slurpees from a nearby 7-Eleven store. For those that don't know, a Slurpee is a frozen drink, usually soda flavors, dispensed from a machine with a handle that you push down or pull up on. The cups come with a clear dome lid and a long straw with a spoon on the end, and maybe it's just me, but the spoon is pretty useless. The best part is, since you get to prepare it yourself, you can mix any of the dozen or so flavors yourself and in any order you'd like. So one of my older cousins and I decided to head out to get the drinks, while the others continued to work in the house. The drive there and the preparing of the frozen beverages were both uneventful within themselves. But what I do remember is walking back outside and hearing a woman screaming something like, "Help me," to my left. I turned my head only to witness a middle-aged man wrestling the keys away from an older woman. She was maybe in her 60s. I froze and just watched the scene play out in front of me. The man did manage to snatch the keys away from the lady and hopped inside her car, backing it up and taking off with it. The problem was the lady had somehow fallen and landed with her legs under the car, so when he backed up over her. The police were called, of course, and my cousin and I stayed to give our statements. I managed to memorize the license plate to the stolen car, which came in handy when the lady was so in shock she couldn't remember it herself. I was always told growing up to get the plate number if there was ever an emergency involving a car, and so I did just that. I remember hearing later that the car was found about 30 miles or about 48 kilometers away from where it was stolen. I'm not sure what happened to the lady, the man, or the car, and since this was the early 2000s, I highly doubt that there would be any information online this long after. That 7-Eleven has since closed and become a few different businesses, the most current being a cell phone store. But anytime I venture past that place, I always think back to that event that I witnessed many years ago.